There are many shows dedicated to Magic the Gathering strategies, decks, and formats. But unlike all of them, this channel is about discussing an individual card, an isolated card, an unrelated card. This is an Magic card. Hello and welcome back, Rectangle enthusiasts, to another thrilling and incredibly worthwhile installment of An Magic Card, the mediocre YouTube TV show where I exhaustively discuss randomly selected Magic cards. I'm the ringleader of this dollar store circus, Dusty Cupboards. And before we start jumping through flaming hoops and performing feats which defy death itself, we've first got to hoist up the polished mirror of digital documentation and take a backwards glance at some of the most gripping comments from our previous episode. IRL Fine Gaming applauded me for pronouncing Azmoran Mardukat Icenak Oldakar, which I appreciate, but which I wasn't sure was actually true. There has recently been some hot Azmoran Mardukat Icenak Oldakar gossip going around, with rumors that she will in fact get a card in an upcoming set, and this has caused many internet humans to discuss her more frequently. Somebody asked the cool uncle of Magic the Gathering, Mark Rosewater, about the name's pronunciation, and he indicated that Ethan Fleischer was the authority on the subject, so I reached out to him on Twitter, and according to him, my pronunciation sounds right. Pathogen 7 brought up some more knights in the long history of chivalrous rivalry, which doesn't surprise me because the trope has been going on for a long time in Magic the Gathering. Just recently in Time Spiral Remastered, I was reminded of the card Rift-Marked Knight, which is somehow both a White Knight reference and a Black Knight reference at the same time. Morgan Albertson got hit by a car, which is very alarming. The next time you see a car, I would encourage all of you to point at it sternly and say something nasty on behalf of our friend, Morgan Albertson. Also, for real, I really hope you're doing okay, Morgan. Having reviewed an appropriate number of comments, we are now ready, both mentally and physically, to find out which randomly selected Magic card we shall be assigned for this episode.
Wait, what? I'm looking at the Whirling Dervish Gatherer page here, getting ready to hit this random button for the next card, and I just realized that in the rulings down here, it says Dune Rider Outlaw instead of Whirling Dervish, which is as you know, since you watched the last episode, all 50 minutes of it, you know that is the alternate dimension, Planar Chaos Black color shifted version of Whirling Dervish. That is wild. Anyways, let's go ahead and click this little button up here and get our new card for this episode. It is Stairs to Infinity. This is okay. I mean, these are cool, but this isn't a real Magic card. I mean, no, I mean it definitely is not a Magic card. This is it's a special card. I'm not going to get into it. I don't have time. We have to talk about actual Magic cards. This is cool. It's a beautiful illustration, and the special set that these plain cards are from is pretty cool. It's pretty neato, but not for this episode. This isn't not for right now. I'm a little bit tempted to do an episode about this weird card thing, but no, I'm gonna click the button again. It's Pontiff of Blight.
Pontiff of Blight is a rare 6-mana 2/7 zombie cleric, and the 33rd card from Dragon's Maze, following Maze Abomination and preceding Rakdos Drake. This expansion of both draconic and labyrinthian nature is the 61st Magic set which Wizards of the Coast so graciously blessed us with. If you like mazes, then good news. Dragon's Maze contains 6 of the 16 maze-related Magic cards ever printed, including the aforementioned Abomination. If you like dragons, however, I'm very sorry to inform you that there are 0 dragon cards in Dragon's Maze. The word dragon in the set title is possessive, meaning that a dragon owns the maze, not that the maze has dragons. We could consider the card Dragon Shift to be a dragon, because it does turn things into dragons, but that would detract from the nominal irony of the set, so it is entirely excluded from consideration, and will spend the rest of this video locked away in an old wooden chest. The narrative behind Dragon's Maze is actually pretty cute, at least if you find contractually binding obstacle courses to be as precocious as I do, in what will surely cause at least some amount of confusion throughout this video. Dragon's Maze is the 3rd set from the 2nd block on the plane of Ravnica, which means that it is the 6th set on Ravnica out of the 9 sets that have ever been located there. We have yet to stop on Ravnica in our Madhouse Planar Safari, but I very cleverly mentioned the plane briefly in one of my previous videos to whet your collective appetites for the the Eastern European political drama that defines this very popular world. Like many planets in science fiction, planes featured in Magic the Gathering are often unrealistically dominated by one biome or characteristic. This is something the creators of Magic the Gathering have admitted, and it's really just a practical choice to help make the planes seem more varied and memorable. We've seen this before with planes like Mirrodin, which is shiny and chrome, Innistrad, which is spooky and gothic, and Olgrotha, which is most easily identifiable by the simple fact that everyone who lives there is absolutely miserable. Ravnica's shtick is that the entire plane is one gigantic city. When getting into broader discussions of planes in Magic the Gathering, you eventually reach this dangerous conceptual precipice where you are forced to confront the distinction between a plane, the term used loosely within Magic the Gathering to describe the different worlds that planeswalkers journey to in their Sliders-esque adventures, and the very similar but more scientifically specific term planet, which we blood-filled eyeball-having humans in the real world use to refer to the big balls of potting soil where we keep all of our stuff. If used interchangeably, we are given the impression that the wacky and wild planes of Magic the Gathering are celestial bodies that float within their own distinct but similar cosmic vacuum bubbles. But like the universe outside of our own dirt clod, this scenario only leads us to ask more questions. Planets do not drift alone through the void. Well, okay, some planets do drift alone through the void, but most planets do not drift alone through the void. They need a star, or maybe even several stars, to give them things like energy, warmth, and wicked bad sunburns. If a plane in Magic the Gathering is a single planet in a planetary system, then there are potentially other planets within that system, and those planets could have life. Are there Magic the Gathering aliens? Who really built the pyramids? All of this speculation begins to feel much too similar to the larger cosmological inquiries that define our own quest for universal understanding. And more importantly, it really starts to detract from the more immediate things, like the concept that there is a maze owned by a dragon. Ravnica, like many planes in Magic, is actually known to be spherical though, and is therefore both a plane and a planet. There are planes which are definitively known not to be spherical though. The plane, which is both Lorwyn and Shadowmoor, is flat like a flippity flapjack, and you can see the world's weird outer edge portrayed in the card Primal Beyond. There is another plane called Pyrulia, which is featured on one single card, and which is known to be in the shape of a Dyson sphere, which has a central star encased in a densely forested planet. Since Ravnica is both planet-like and completely covered by a city, that means we could describe it as an ecumenopolis. Like the term Dyson sphere, this is another term from speculative fiction, which is used to describe something that is planet-like and completely covered by a city. In your squishy meat brain, you might be familiar with other ecumenopoli from franchises like Star Wars, Warhammer 40,000, or Isaac Asimov's foundational science fiction series, the Foundation series. I tried to read the first book of Isaac Asimov's foundational science fiction series, the Foundation series, several years ago, but unfortunately I wasn't able to finish it on account of the fact that I didn't enjoy reading it at all, not even a little bit. The Ecumenopolis of Ravnica is divided into 10 guilds, each of which is aligned with a pair of colors. As we mentioned in episode number 7, the names of these guilds have become synonymous with the color pairs themselves. The guilds on Ravnica coexist in large part due to a magical contract written by the magical lawyer Azor, who founded the Azorius Guild, which he very humbly named after himself. Azor was a stupid smart sphinx and a planeswalker who traveled from world to world dispensing governmental bureaucracy like somebody throwing candy from a very boring political science themed parade float. In Magic the Gathering, law magic is known as hieromancy, so when I mention that term throughout the rest of this video, now you'll know what the dang I'm talking about. According to my spell check, it's also a real word, which is curious and also a big relief because it means I don't have to stare at the little annoying squiggly red line every time I type it in the script for this episode. After Azor left Ravnica to go do other important things, which may or may not have included getting stood up for a date with Ugin, and then getting stranded on the planar equivalent of a desert island for thousands of years after intentionally removing his own ability to planeswalk, the residents of Ravnica were left in check by an especially powerful piece of hieromancy known as the Guild Pact. This contract kept the peace between the 10 factions until it was farcically shattered when the Law and Order Guild Boros arrested the leader of the Subversion and Espionage Guild, Demir. This created a paradox of sorts, because the Law and Order Guild was carrying out their sworn duty of maintaining law and order. But the leader of the Dimir Guild was also carrying out his sworn duty to create problems and be a creepy maniacal sewer vampire. So unfortunately, this conflict represented a legal conundrum that even Unfrozen Caveman Lawyer couldn't have resolved. This is where the maze, which is overseen by a dragon but does not contain any dragons, comes into play. Because like most examples of real-world arbitration, the Ecumenopolis of Ravnica deploys the tried and true strategy of having representatives run through a wacky maze to draft new binding legal documents. Among the 10 maze runners are some names that veteran rectangle aficionados will surely recognize. The Sphinx-born Azorius Senate was represented by Mariska Hargitay lookalike Lavinia. Tajik, who wields the Wiggly Sword, represented the Boros Legion. Mirko Vosk represented the secretive and very flamboyant House Dimir. Virals represented the Compost Lords of the Golgari Swarm. Rurik and Thar, more commonly just known as Rurik Thar, represented the Gruul clans. Teysa Karlov represented the Orzhov Syndicate. I'll talk more about them in a minute. Exava represented the Cult of Rakdos, and has the great distinction of having the most boring card out of all of them. Amara Tandris represented the unnervingly communal Selesnya Conclave. Vorel, who was somehow half merfolk and half human, or 3/4 human, 1/4 fish, I'm not actually sure how that works, represented the biohacker Simic Combine. And lastly, the mad scientists of the Izzet League specifically created a jello cyborg named Melek to be the perfect maze runner. But then the planeswalker Ral Zarek literally just murdered him and took his place, which honestly seems like a pretty heinous act, considering that Ral Zarek is now ostensibly a good guy. I don't really know, it seems a little bit messed up. For some reason, Niv Mizzet, the leader and founder of the Izzet Guild, was tasked with overseeing the whole maze running exercise, so I guess he is the eponymous dragon from Dragon's Maze. Although to be clear, he did not actually create the maze. Azor, the Sphinx, did, so maybe the set should be called Sphinx's Maze instead. Regardless of naming rights, at the end of the maze, there was apparently an unnamed bailiff who gave each of the maze runners the ability to cast a devastating spell that would destroy the entire Ecumenopolis of Ravnica and kill all of its inhabitants. This seems like a pretty terrible idea. In theory, I guess that giving each of the runners this terrible weapon could be a test to see which of them would prioritize the safety of the entire plane over the ambitions of their individual guild. But honestly, I just wouldn't be comfortable giving a weapon of mass destruction to Rurik and Thar, who are quoted on the card Gruul Guildgate as saying, and I quote,
"Old turf, powerful turf, much good blood spilled here."
I mean, honestly, they're basically monsters. Luckily for all the endlessly cosmopolitan residents of Ravnica, modern Magic mascot and typeface namesake Jace Beleren was also there for some reason, and he used his mighty mind magic to control all of the guild representatives and made sure that none of them mouth-pressed the Doomsday incantation. The unnamed bailiff witnessed this act and proclaimed Jace to be the new Guild Pact because he was able to create peace amongst the squabbling representatives. This turn of events raises an absolute cornucopia of questions. Foremost, it seems like a terrible idea to attach your world's most important legal document to a brooding wizard whose most defining characteristic is his ability to simply leave your plane and go elsewhere. This is like if the United States of America stapled the Constitution to a migratory bird. What would the United States do when that goose flies up to Canada for the winter? We need that document, and we did not Xerox it before affixing it to the bird. Also, for the record, I'm going to bring up migratory geese at least once more in this video, which says a lot about the quality of my Magic the Gathering YouTube videos. The second bewildering aspect of making Jace Beleren the living Guild Pact is the fact that by using his mind control powers to prevent any of the guild representatives from casting the Supreme Verdict spell, he essentially interfered in the process and probably deprived the guilds from a real opportunity to achieve peace in the face of total annihilation. While I already stated that giving Rurik Thar or the very boring Blood Witch Exava? Is it Exava or Exara? Exava. If I just search Exava, that should probably answer my question. Exava? It is Exava. While I already stated that giving Rurik Thar or the very boring Blood Witch Exava the ability to turn the entire world into rubble and corpses was a little bit extreme, the goal was clearly to force a stalemate in which no party could emerge victorious. Allowing Jace to stop this planned interaction and then rewarding him with absolute authority seems to undermine the entire process, even if the entire process was fundamentally ridiculous to begin with. Lastly, what is up with the bailiff, and why does it have the ability to bestow two-headed ogres and blood witches with unspeakable destructive powers? And why does it have the ability to select who the next Guild Pact will be? In the entirety of the 2-paragraph story summary I read, the character of the Bailiff is never named. It appears to be a magical construct created by Azor to enforce his contrived and maze-oriented system of governance. But honestly, if this robot butler Bailiff can be trusted to select the next Guild Pact, and also has the ability to hand out apocalypse chimes, then I'm not really sure why it can't just be the Guild Pact itself. The ability to assign absolute power is in itself a kind of absolute power. Regardless, a bunch of other stuff then happens, and goodness, the Guild Pact got all messed up again, because reasons. And then Niv Mizzet, who was the one officiating the running of the maze in the first place, performed some big brain dragon stuff and intentionally got himself killed so that he could then be reborn as the new Guild Pact. It seems like this is almost a convoluted form of plot redaction, because making Jace the Guild Pact wasn't just ham-fisted and weird, but also really awkward from a narrative perspective. Ultimately, having the dragon who is given the responsibility of overseeing the maze running be the one who was then given the responsibility that would be granted by the running of the maze is really a much simpler resolution. Making Niv Mizzet the Guild Pact is like attaching the United States Constitution to the Statue of Liberty, rather than a migratory goose. It's still pretty dumb, but at least there's some sort of thematic connection there. I'm sure many of the details contained in the summarization were slightly off, and I look forward to reading lots of corrections in the comment section below. Overall, I'm really not too interested in the cookie-cutter geopolitics of Ravnica, but I will admit that the maze running competition is a neat setup for a story. I'm pretty sure this setup is also the basis of the young adult book series called The Maze Runner, although since I'm an old adult rather than a young adult, I haven't actually read any of these books. For the sake of this YouTube video, I dedicated several minutes of my time to skimming the Wikipedia synopsis for the first book, however, and I can confirm that the story does in fact contain individuals who are forced to run through a maze. And just like the maze that is run in Dragon's Maze, the maze that is run in Maze Runner contains no dragons. Unlike the implicit maze in Dragon's Maze, the maze in Maze Runner is more of a Cretan labyrinth, in that the predictably hopeless and tortured teenage protagonists are trying to escape it. The book Maze Runner, and potentially also the film franchise it spawned, as inferred purely from a brief unenthusiastic Wikipedia perusal, is essentially the Hunger Games combined with the film Cube. I haven't actually read or seen the Hunger Games either. I have seen the movie Cube though, at least a couple times. You can go ahead and put that on my resume. Mazes, like quicksand and mirages, are much less commonplace than the Saturday morning cartoons and comic books of our childhood might have led us to believe. In my entire life, I have probably encountered no more than 5 mazes, one of which was a hedge maze, which was much too short to offer any real challenge, and the rest of which were the Midwest mainstay corn maze, which aren't as charming or atmospheric as most fictional mazes, but are often turkey leg adjacent. I doubt any of the Ravnica guild representatives got to eat a turkey leg and an apple cider slushie after they finished running the implicit maze. Although if you told me that Rurik Thar ate a turkey leg while running the maze, I would believe you. When I was in middle school, I actually constructed a stereotypical particle board maze for a science project. Putting a mouse through a maze is very cliched, but I was enthralled by the maze visuals shown in the film Dark City, and was really more interested in creating the miniature labyrinth as an art object rather than for testing any scientific hypothesis. For this experiment, I purchased a feeder mouse from a local pet store, which I was told would live between 60 and 90 days. I named the mouse Max, after the drummer Max Weinberg from Bruce Springsteen's E Street Band. I have no recollection why I chose this name, although at the time Weinberg was the band leader on Late Night with Conan O'Brien, and I vividly remember that he jumped onto the drums to play along with the band Death from Above 1979, when they appeared as the musical guest on that program. And I can only assume that this moment was the instigating event, since I was informed the mouse wouldn't live very long. Naming it after a fleeting happenstance might have also made more sense, but the pet shop attendant misled me, and the mouse ended up living for more than 3 years, before I had to sadly bury it in a small wooden box with a single coin next to the rose bush in my parents' backyard. If you haven't seen the film Dark City, I recommend it. It has big time Demir vibes, and the ending correlates to several strange concepts which I've already discussed in this absurd video. Our card this week is not a Demir card though. It's distinctly Orzhov, which can be deduced from several of its visual traits. The card has the Extort ability, which contains a hybrid black and white mana symbol in its reminder text. I'll talk more about this in a minute. Its text box box also contains a watermark with the symbol of the Orzhov Syndicate, and within the artwork we see the same eclipsed sun logo at the end of the cleric zombie's staff. The Orzhova are the most interesting Ravnican guild to me, as their core symbiosis of church and bank has some really interesting implications. As somebody who doesn't have much investment in religion or much faith in modern economics, I can't help but get a double whammy of cynical satisfaction from this undead organized religion / organized crime family combo. Living in a country that is supposed to be built upon the democratization of all things, it's strange to me how much political policy in the United States is dictated by finance and religion, which both tend to take the form of classical hierarchies. I could write a lot of words about these contradictions which haunt my Purple Mountain's majesty, and the insidious way the Orzhova use their subtle influence to coerce the desperate and destitute residents of Ravnica to both pay and pray at their altars of gold. To put it simply though, a creepy pontiff who takes your money is perfectly at home in the Church of the Boo Brothers. Pontiff of Blight is not a card I was familiar with before it popped up on my computer screen and waltzed into my heart. As is always the case with these episodes, there is a bit of serendipity in its random card selection, however. Last night, while preparing dinner, I put on the most recent episode of The Command Zone, a podcast about Commander. When I first started playing Commander, I listened to this show quite a lot, and I still try and catch an episode here and there when I get a chance. On this most recent episode, they were discussing cards that synergize well with the new commanders from Strixhaven. And just a fraction of the way through the episode, our undead clergy came up.
So you can play Pontiff of Blight.
Pontiff of Blight. Pontiff of Blight.
Perhaps despite my lack of personal familiarity, Pontiff of Blight is popular in the Commander format. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Overall, this kind of coincidence happens a lot during the production of these episodes, and the sheer frequency of these events does almost seem fated. But since I'm a godless heathen, as previously stated, I guess we'll just chalk it up to the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon and forget about our natural, superstitious human instincts, at least for now. Growing up in a secular household, my understanding of organized religion was always pretty loosey-goosey. To this day, I couldn't tell you what the difference between a pastor, a reverend, a minister, a preacher, or a priest is. I know they're all big on the J-man, and that's really about it. As a child, I had a friend who was Catholic, and his parents never even made eye contact with me, and he wasn't allowed to play any of the cool armies in Warhammer. I had another friend who was Lutheran, and he would always try and convince me to go to church with them because they had a jazz band, and according to him, it was chill. In hindsight, that actually sounds kind of cool, but I was terrified of being put into unfamiliar environments because I had previously attended a Boy Scout meeting in the hopes of receiving a Swiss Army knife, only to be ambushed with Christian recitations and religious rituals for which I did not know the call and response. I currently know of the word pontiff mostly because of its relation to the act of pontificating, which is essentially the underpinning of this entire channel. According to the internet, the word pontiff simply means pope though, which is not at all what I was expecting. I had assumed pontiff was just another in the wide array of Christian titles that confuse and bewilder me. The term pope to me, however, is very specific. A friend of mine brought a pope bobblehead back from Italy, and little Francis currently sits on a shelf in my living room next to a jar full of hexahedral dice. If Pontiff of Blight is a pope, then based on the rules of magic, you could legally have 4 popes on the battlefield at once. And that seems like a lot of popes. Apparently, there are actually 4 popes in the real world though, with a few niche popes in addition to the well-known Catholic Pope Francis. Tawadros II of Alexandria, whose name evokes several different magic cards, is the Pope of the Coptic Orthodox Church in Alexandria. There's also Peter III, who is the Pope of the Palmarian Catholic Church, which I know doesn't have anything to do with Pomeranians, but I guarantee it would be better if it did. Looking at the Palmarian Catholic Church website, I'm getting some pretty heavy cult vibes, and while I'm hesitant to be critical of anybody's religion on my wacky Magic the Gathering YouTube channel, the Wikipedia page for the Palmarian Church also says that scholars, journalists, and former followers almost universally describe the organization as a cult. So if you're a Palmarian Catholic and you're watching this video, I'm sorry, but it just appears to be the common consensus. The last pope I could find has a name which rivals Asmarana Mardukad Isenag Oldakar, known quite humbly as His Divine Beatitude, the Pope and Patriarch of the great city of Alexandria, Libya, Pentapolis, Ethiopia, all Egypt and all Africa, Father of Fathers, Pastor of Pastors, Prelate of Prelates, the 13 of the Apostles, and Judge of the Ecumene. This final pope is connected to the Greek Orthodox Church of Alexandria. That's 3 more popes than I was initially aware of, but considering the sheer number of of humans on the planet Earth right now, the difference between 4 popes and 1 pope is actually pretty insignificant. This means popes, while not singular, are still very rare. And I guess Pontiff of Blight is also a rare card, so that matches up. Magic the Gathering actually has 2 other pontiffs though, both of which are also in the Orzhov Syndicate. One of them is only uncommon, and none of them are legendary. So you could potentially have 12 popes on the battlefield at once. That's an entire squadron of popes. Obviously, this is a fantasy game with dragons and fairies, so we shouldn't get too caught up on the plausibility of a pope squad. But really, how many popes does one city planet need? It's also important that you know that while writing this section, I misspelled pope as poop multiple times, and I cackled like an idiot every single time. The word blight is less complicated than pontiff and simply means rotting or diseased. In the case of Pontiff of Blight, we could assume that this is just a descriptor, since the creature itself is a zombie, and those have been known to rot on occasion. But much like the set Dragon's Maze, the way it's written implies otherwise. This isn't a blighted pontiff, it's a pontiff of blight, and the pinko socialist inside of me would like to suggest that the blight that's being referenced here is an economic blight, being inflicted upon the impoverished residents of Ravnica through the Orzhov's predatory loan practices and underhanded financial dealings, rather than any sort of biological blight. The blight being created by the pontiff is urban blight, a tangible manifestation of the cankerous parasite that is unfettered capitalism within the vast writhing body of the Ravnican ecumenopolis. Also, apparently another synonym for the word blight is banjax, which is a very cool term, and one which I would like to try and incorporate into my everyday usage, but sadly, I know that's not really going to work out. The mechanic which our banjax pope possesses does a good job of representing the financial methods that the Orzhov employ. The ability Extort allows you to slowly bleed your opponents dry, like a payday loan. This ability is featured on 13 cards from Gatecrash and Dragon's Maze, and allows you to pay extra mana when you cast a spell to siphon a point of life from your opponents. If you have multiple opponents, you can get multiple points of life with a single activation. I have personally used 2 cards with the Extort ability, Blind Obedience and Cryptghast, and I still have a Cryptghast in one of my stupid EDH decks, but I've never actually activated Extort in my entire life. Honestly, I kind of just think of it as flavor text. Paying 1 mana to gain 1 to 3 life just isn't really super appealing to me, especially in a format like Commander, where you begin with a big gulp's worth of hit points. Maybe if you could activate it multiple times as like a pseudo shade effect, or if all of your cards with Extort would be triggered by a single activation and stack up like the ability Exalted, then maybe I would find it more appealing. As indicated by my previous anecdote about the Command Zone podcast though, apparently people are actually playing these cards in the Toontown format of EDH. According to the statistics tracking website EDHREC, our Moldy Papacy is appearing in nearly 5,000 decks, which blows past all of our previous Commander contenders easily as the most popular EDH card ever featured on this channel. Looking at the decks where it is showing up, we can see a lot of life gain synergies, as well as at least one deck that cares about clerics, and one deck that cares about big butts. We haven't really touched upon the Pontiff's creature type or stat block too much yet, but both are significant here. Clerics and zombies are both tribes that have seen a lot of support in Magic, with zombies being among the most popular and supported tribes of all time. Being a 2/7 is also both remarkable and critical to the extortionist strategy that this card encourages. Pontiff of Blight doesn't just have Extort, but it also gives Extort to all of your other creatures. So if you have a pile of vanilla creatures lying around and a heap of black or white mana, suddenly you can take your opponents to collections and rob them blind. This does mean that your vanilla creatures will no longer be vanilla creatures though, and will therefore stop benefiting from Muraganda petroglyphs. So there's both pros and cons. This mass granting of abilities puts Pontiff of Blight in a category I will refer to as
Ability Lords.
alongside cards like Adriana, who grants melee, Marchesa, who grants Dethrone, Heliod, who grants Vigilance, Samut, who grants Haste, Sublime Archangel, which grants Exalted, Surak Dragonclaw, which grants Trample, Bela the Nightclad, who grants Intimidate, or Zagras, who grants Death Touch. Some of these abilities have duplicate effects on other cards, and there are also narrower examples like Safara, who grants Indestructible to creatures with flying, or Cavalry Master, which gives the ability Flanking to creatures that already have the ability Flanking, which is really dumb, and one of my favorite Magic cards ever printed. Because with the Extort ability, even spread across your entire team, you're only snagging a coin here or there. It might take a while for this plot to play out, which is why having such high toughness makes so much sense for our greedy ghoul. As an excellent turtle-like blocker, the Pontiff enables a more long-term game plan. There are only 5 other creatures ever printed with 2 power and 7 toughness, and none of them have any papal authority, although all of them would have the ability Extort if they were on the battlefield with Pontiff of Blight. Showing up in a legitimately impressive 2% of EDH EDH decks implies that this card is delivering something that Commander players are looking for. And unlike a lot of popular cards, I think that's actually a multifaceted package deal, rather than just one specific effect. Between its cleric typing, its life-draining potential, and its big caboose, I think we're seeing a triangulation of qualities that allow the Pontiff to excel for different reasons under different commanders. Despite all of its popularity, you can still purchase your very own zombie pope for just a couple of American currency units. This is partially probably because it's been reprinted, with it appearing most recently in the Orzhov-themed guild kit that was sold alongside Ravnica Allegiance, and previously having shown up in the 2014 Sworn in Darkness Commander Precon deck, helmed by Ob Nixilis of the Black Oath. Appearing in any pre-constructed commander deck will naturally cause a card to see more play in EDH, but I don't think it's fair to point to this inclusion as a significant reason for its continued presence on commander tables. One of the reasons that it does see so much play though is surely its flexibility as a mono black card. Due to the color identity rules of EDH, the more colors that a card has, as indicated by mana symbols present in its cost and rules text, the less decks can run it. This brings up another strange detail about the Pontiff though, and all cards that have Extort natively, and this is the tiny little hybrid white and black mana symbol which appears within the reminder text for the ability. While hybrid mana symbols are functionally either or within the rules of Magic, within Commander they still indicate a dual color identity. This is something that lots of people love to argue about, and if you want to do so in the comment section below,
Go wild.
reminder text doesn't have a mechanical function, however. It's simply there literally to remind you of what an ability does, and therefore it is exempt from the color identity restrictions that other mana symbols appearing within text boxes might impose. There might be a number of examples of this, but the only one that I can actually think of is the artifact Charmed Pendant, which contains a sample casting cost in its reminder text to demonstrate how the card works. Weirdly enough, this example casting cost is identical to the cost of Spinal Embrace, which we featured previously in episode number 7. The same episode where we previously talked about Ravnica. The serendipities continue to compound. Bader Meinhof is putting in overtime. Because the reminder text doesn't count, Charmed Pendant is still a colorless card, just as the Blightfather is still a mono black card. Despite these clear rules justifications for the Pontiff's color identity, there are still some number of commander players out there in this crazy world who will point out the aesthetic disconnect caused by including a card with even half of a bright sunny white mana symbol stamped onto its smooth proprietary cardstock surface. This is the same subjective objection which leads some people to dislike off-color fetch lands or even off-color tokens. And while I sympathize with where these nitpicks might come from, ultimately I think that the basic rules of color identity are pretty solid. So slap this rare $2 bottom-heavy corpse clergy into all of your dang EDH decks and drain the golden lifeblood from your friends as their attackers slam uselessly into its sizable posterior. Pontiff of Blight certainly isn't going to see play in any other formats. One other thing which might attract attention to this decaying icon is the artwork, which is by Magic illustration superstar Seb McKinnon. Throughout Magic's history, there are many artists who have attained extensive accolades, but in recent memory, none is as lauded as Seb. So much so that when I saw his name, I was immediately exasperated by the task of discussing somebody whose work has already received so much attention. Seb's work is so beloved that he even had his own special set of promos which came out recently. I will say though that in general, despite being a big old hipster, that there is a good reason why Seb's work is so popular, and that's because it is very good. Seb also represents something to Magic enjoyers though, which is a return to a more stylized and individualized approach among Magic illustrators. For a while, with the exception of some older artists who themselves retained a Seb-like following, Magic art definitely defaulted to a more heavily homogenized look, with an emphasis on consistency in art direction. Ultimately, I think it's possible for some artists to deliver stellar work within a prescribed overarching look, but I'm also glad that we've seen more eccentric visuals return. One thing that I had never truly considered, however, was that an artist like Seb McKinnon, who is associated with this move towards distinct visual styles, might have actually started out producing more standard Magic card fare, and the illustration on Pontiff of Blight really made me consider this possibility. Most cardboard conjurers will point the blame-ridden finger directly at Wizards of the Coast when decrying the homogeny present in modern card art, and I'm sure that their emphasis on style guides and careful art direction did contribute to a large extent, but I don't get the impression that they were ever suppressing individual artists' ability to deliver more unique pieces. Throughout Seb's early Magic card catalog, we see some paintings which definitely have strong components of his signature spooky storybook style. I honestly don't think Seb fans would identify his first two cards, Edge of Autumn and Cavern Thoktar, as even belonging to this much-loved artist. Flipping through early examples of his 148 contributions to Magic the Gathering, we don't really start to get wafts of his recognizably morose fairy tale scent until we reach Immortal Servitude. Throughout the next few baker's dozens of cards, the style oscillate between a more unassuming unassuming modern fantasy approach, and what is now recognizable as iconic Seb style, simplified twee Cupid doll fables meets scary stories to tell in the dark. The fact that I wrote that sentence and thought that it was coherent is legitimately a strike against me. His preference towards stark symbolism, classic fantasy imagery, and forlorn vestiges of forgotten kingdoms makes his work equal parts Dark Souls and Book of Kells. As his highly textured, graphic, and macabre pieces began to gain favor among kitchen table wizards, it only makes sense that both his desire to deliver these pieces and clear permission from the company which was commissioning him led to an increase in his work's bold and eye-grabbing look. If you scan over his card illustrations and chronology, it reads like a gradient that grows increasingly Seb as it progresses, until reaching a climax in approximately October of 2017, when his promo illustration for the card Stasis hit Magic Online. I would describe this piece as being quintessentially Seb McKinnon. I would also describe this piece as being fantastic. It's possible that since this was an online-only piece, there was more freedom to do something unique, but I can only assume that the response to this painting was quite positive, because following this we see cards like Phantom Tiger, Dirge of Dread, Rite of Belzenlock, and many other pieces which really pushed the envelope in terms of limited color palette and expressionist depiction. It's pretty fitting that Stasis stands out as a turning point for Seb's portfolio, because famously that card previously also had very unique artwork, which was contributed by the aunt of Magic's creator, Richard Garfield, PhD. This is the only piece that Faye Jones ever contributed to Magic the Gathering, since she was just a fine artist with a geeky nephew, rather than wanting to be a fantasy illustrator. But ironically, this painting has caused more debate than almost any others in the history of Magic the Gathering, and while some people might act like the homogeny of modern Magic art is a disservice being thrust upon them by corporate market research and focus groups, it's probably worth mentioning the amount of negativity that has historically been directed towards this piece by Faye Jones, which, like much of her other work, I'm inclined to describe as being quite brilliant. Seb's style is quite different from Faye's though, looking more at home alongside something like Edvard Munch. Edvard Munch is most famous for his painting The Scream, but this painting, titled Sick Child, is much more reflective of his work overall, and also does a better job of encapsulating his tortured life. If you ever want to learn more about Edvard Munch, I would recommend watching the 1974 film about him, titled Edvard Munch. It's 3.5 hours long, and it feels like it's 3.5 hours long, but it is very good. If I had to select a few of Seb's pieces as his best, I would definitely include Stasis, as well as probably his Chalice of the Void promo, the card Pale Rider of Trostad, Adunis River Trawler, Death Sprout, Rite of the Serpent, and the somewhat similar looking Kuumbaj Witches. Kuumbaj? How do you pronounce that? Overall, I think when his pieces work, they really work, but that sometimes they don't quite land, and the repetition of certain elements throughout his work can tend to make them feel a little bit interchangeable. I also think it's funny to realize, in light of his recent meteoric rise in popularity, that many of his early illustrations are probably completely unassociated with him. I personally had no idea that he was the artist for Relic of Progenitus. I probably wouldn't have guessed that Pontiff of Blight was one of his pieces either, although it does contain many of his hallmarks. The grim figure is very on brand for Seb McKinnon, and the mottled grays in the background are right in line with his heavy reliance on texture to establish tone. This piece has a lot more depth than a lot of his current work though, and the light emitted from the staff and shining through the signature Orzhov stained glass windows help to create an atmosphere of silent despair. The low angle of the piece reinforces the religious authority that this frail skeletal figure embodies. The layout of this piece is really effective, really nailing the art school rule of thirds, and using the extreme shadows on the talon-like hand to help it stand out against the blinding light which is pouring into the ancient cathedral through the tall Gothic windows. It's hard to tell how tall this pontiff actually is, and these little figures in the bottom right-hand corner could potentially be people, but I'm pretty sure that if they were, that would make Pontiff of Blight a giant zombie cleric, rather than a zombie cleric. So perhaps the pontiff is just speaking to a congregation of rats, or its action figure collection. I would also like to point out that despite being so gritty and textured, all of Seb McKinnon's artwork is produced digitally, which really flies in the face of a lot of the anti-digital art rhetoric that exists in Magic communities. Personally, I'm going to give this piece a B rating on my personal subjective art scale, and I'm going to give this piece a C- on my personal subjective scale, which measures how easily identifiable a piece is as belonging to Seb McKinnon. Some of you watching this video might be getting the impression that I'm unenthused by Seb McKinnon's work, and while this isn't really the case, I do think that it plays into the same inexplicable pattern of serendipity that has acted as a through line for this entire video, and through all of the videos I've made. When I click the random button on Gatherer and discover what card I'm going to be exhaustively discussing, I don't have any lofty expectations, but it does seem like I repeatedly end up being assigned cards which are related to subjects I actively don't find interesting. Not only was this episode steeped in the bewildering idiosyncrasies of various Christian denominations, but the last episode was also heavily based in religion. As a very secular person who has never engaged in religion beyond briefly attending Jewish youth group to try and flirt with a girl, having to repeatedly walk into the cultural minefield that is discussing the deeply held beliefs of other people is both laborious and kind of stressful. I will say that I've been learning more about religion recently because I discovered that well-known magic YouTuber, Nizahan Magic, also has an entire channel talking about religious history, which I've actually been super into. I learned about this channel because Nizahan posted on Twitter on April 1st that they had uploaded a video about early Christianity, and I legitimately thought it was an April Fool's joke. I responded to their post on Twitter, telling them that I thought it was an April Fool's joke. They responded to my response and told me that it was not. One of the videos on this channel is about how people in medieval times thought that the barnacle goose was literally a barnacle that transformed into a goose, and therefore people with dietary restrictions debated whether or not eating them counted as eating meat or seafood. I told my coworker about this and she did not believe me. That's how good this YouTube video was. This was the second migratory goose reference, by the way. The point of all of this is that through the measured and computer-assisted process of randomly selecting magic cards, I serendipitously keep humorously being forced to discuss subjects I'm actively disinterested in. I would not have discussed Seb McKinnon by choice. As somebody who simply dislikes all foil cards, I would not have chosen to go over the wide variety of these premium treatments in my last video. And I certainly would never have wanted to discuss J.R.R.R.R. Tolkien multiple times in multiple previous videos. If I was a person of faith, I would almost suspect that some kind of cosmological entity was intentionally forcing me to perform some kind of bizarre and mildly entertaining form of weirdly specific online penance. Of course, ultimately, I always end up finding something that sparks my curiosity when exploring these unappealing subjects, but the serendipity of it all still smacks of supernatural influence. I'm not going to go as far as to say that I suddenly believe in ghosts, or that I'm going to join the Palmarian Catholic Church and become some kind of weirdo cult member, but remember back now to middle school, when my maze-running Max Weinberg mouse died, and I chose to bury it with a silver coin, so that it might pay its entrance fee to the mouse afterlife. So maybe all along the spiritual and fiscal beliefs that drive the obsequious residents of Ravnica to prostrate themselves at the decaying feet of a shyster pope is actually more relatable to me than I might have previously thought. Alright everybody, that is the end of episode number 13. I hope you enjoyed it. In retrospect, I probably could have made some kind of unlucky number 13 reference during the video, and it would have tied really well into the spooky card and the theme of uncanny coincidences. But I guess I'll just have to wait until episode number 666 to employ that spooky gimmick. Like with the last episode, I really tried to maintain a healthy focus on having fun. Similar to how our card selection forces me to explore things I'm not normally interested in, becoming a super famous content creator has also pushed me to do things I wouldn't ordinarily do. A while back, I participated in a charity EDH gauntlet to raise money for Trans Lifeline, and that was both super fun and also philanthropically productive. If you want to break your immersion that I'm an unkept antique hutch, you can go check out the video of that event and see my bare human phalanges and worn cardigan as I successfully murder a table full of super nice people by casting Chandra's Ignition on a 72/72 Hamletback Goliath. In addition to this activity, I also spent an entire weekend playing the Mengu Cube, which is the Magic Online cube draft created by future Hall of Famer Andrea Mengucci. I also finally got around to playing the game Hylics, which is kind of like what you would get if aliens abducted David Lynch and forcibly made him recreate the game Earthbound out of clay. I've also been really busy with my job in addition to serving on a board, a committee, a commission, a coalition, and a task force. All of this is me trying to basically apologize for not releasing these videos at a higher frequency, but I want all of you to know that I think of you always. And I hope you're venturing outside of your comfort zones a bit and playing obtuse lo-fi computer games. And if not, I hope that in the very least, my terrible YouTube channel is a small bright spot in this dark, tortured fairy tale world we live in. And I hope I'll see you all next time on Air Magical.